So we've talked about the growth of the above ground portion or the shoot of the plant. Now we'll move into the below ground portion or the root of the plant, still on the vegetative topic. So roots obviously not involved in sexual reproduction. That's an above ground process. And roots, I'd say, have been a little difficult to study in the history of plant research. Obviously, they're underground. They're not something you see right away, and it's a little difficult to observe the growth of roots when really their performance depends on them being surrounded by soil. So a lot more attention has been given to roots a little bit in the recent years, and we'll kind of focus on that. So our intro slide here, this is a type of plant called a mangrove, and it turns out there are a lot of different kinds of mangroves in the world. These are woody plants, trees, and they grow in sandy soil where they don't have a lot of purchase. So when those roots go into the soil, very similar to like when you build a sandcastle and the waves come in, soil doesn't really hold together if it's sand like this in a watery environment. So this is a type of plant that has figured out how to grow its roots kind of sideways, and it builds this network of what they call prop roots or support roots off to the side to keep these plants in place as the soil under them shifts around. So an important strategy for growing, and also an important contribution to the ecology of these places, because they buffer the waves and they create habitat for animals and suitable conditions for other plants to grow around them. So a very important kind of plant, more in the warm tropical parts. This is a marine plant, so this is not something you'd find around here in lakes, but more on ocean sandy shores. All right, on to the roots. So we talked before about how plants grow in general. We have this concept of the apical meristem growing from the apex. And I think it's easy to forget that when we say apex, we're also referring to the root apex. So we often think of apex as the tip of the top. And that's true, but it's not the entire picture for plants. There's also the root apex. So at the apex of the roots, there's an apical meristem. And we covered this before. The root apical meristem is located here, and in a key difference in the roots versus the shoot apical meristem, there's this root cap beyond the apical meristem. So the roots have an extra layer of protection in the root cap, which is different from the protection that the shoot apical meristem had by having these leaves fold over the apical meristem. Otherwise, they both have this kind of dome shape appearance. They are the smallest cells as they're just dividing, located there and then located here. You can kind of see how the cells get smaller and smaller as we reach this important tip of growth here. Also, just in general, the leaves and side branches are made by the shoot, and roots really only produce roots, except in exceptional cases we won't talk about just yet. So the root apical meristem is supported or protected by this root cap. Here's a more three-dimensional image there. And it's buried kind of in this zone here. Another couple important features of the growing tip of the root is that they are not long after growing from the very tip, they start producing these root hairs off to the side. We'll see that the root hairs are very important for these plants collecting the moisture from the soil they're growing through. And it's kind of a very particular zone right near the tip that has the most of these root hairs. So we have just here a germinating seed. This early seedling has some root growth. Here's the root tip that doesn't have the hairs on it. And then just beyond that, the hairs are, you can see they're kind of starting small and then getting bigger. So you can kind of see progression through time. Early on, not quite a zone where there are root hairs being produced. But then after that, the root hairs grow out. And at this point, this is the transition between a root, and this is actually a portion of the stem, basically. So this very young seedling is putting all its effort into these root hairs, but you'd see also in older roots that some of the older root material is missing those root hairs. They've basically grown beyond the time when they need those. Another feature highlighted on this center diagram here is the mucilage sheath. So it's not made up of cells necessarily, but mucilage, slime, basically this plant is exuding some slippery stuff into its environment. And so if you think about roots growing through their environment, they're growing through soil, and soil is a lot of rocks, especially at a microscopic scale. So if you take these delicate cells and have them forcing their way through a rocky, sort of imagine the scrapes you get as you're digging in a sandbox or something like that. It's very delicate material pushing its way through sand. The mucilage helps to lubricate and ease that process of these roots growing into new territory. So lots of important stuff happening right at the tip of the roots there. Within the mucilage sheath, there's an interesting adaptation called border cells. And these are cells produced by the root that end up going out into the environment. And I'll be honest, this still kind of surprises me. So there's cells that the plant made, but then they're disconnected from the plant. And so they end up out in the environment, just around the tip of the root, and they're still alive. So these living cells kind of go out and they're sort of on the frontier of where these root tips are growing, and they help to provide that protective environment for the delicate root tip. What this is showing here is a series of images going from, on the left here, root tip in humid air. So this is a condition the root would be happy to grow through, but if it's just in the air like that, the root border cells aren't inclined to leave the environment. They're just not able to like sneak out into the air. But then in the middle, take that same root and put it into the water, suddenly a bunch of stuff starts to come off of it. So these cells being sloughed off, they've been sort of built up because they can't go anywhere here. And then they're allowed to go out into the environment. And you can just see the abundance of those cells. And then after shaking, they fill the environment. So I like to think of these apical meristems as being very delicate. They're the thing that needs to be protected. They're like the castle keep. And then outside, there are all these armies and soldiers that are protecting them from things that might try to get in there and disable the growth of that delicate meristem. So border cells present. And what do the border cells do? Well, more interesting stuff that they do is that they actually exude DNA into the environment. So I don't know who decided this was the best strategy, but DNA is kind of strandy. So on a molecular level, it's kind of ropey and could get something snagged in there. And so there's DNA in this environment. DNA is sort of able to be dissolved into watery environments. So we have all these border cells, and they're part of this mucilage sheath again. So you can't quite see it, but you can see sort of a haze here of what would be that mucilage environment with cells in it. And here's one of the things that those cells can do. This is from a study that demonstrated that the mucilage sheath, the border cell environment, this is one of its potential defenses. So we'll see later the kinds of organisms that try to attack plants. This is a pretty common soil pest called a nematode. If you took genetics, nematodes are covered as the C. elegans model organism. And these are very abundant in the soil, and they would love to crawl into a root and eat the juicy stuff inside, or maybe become a parasite on the plant inside of the tissue there. And the border cells actually make the environment, they put a chemical out into the environment that disables the nematodes. So from B to C, we see the B, they're sort of squiggly and moving around. And in C, they all straightened out. So they're like paralyzed. So this root border environment paralyzes the nematodes as they grow through. And as we'll also see, the tip of this root is at its most delicate. After it's been growing for a while, the older root tissue is able to kind of thicken up and defend itself a little bit better. So it's this important just at the tip environment where these nematodes are disabled. Now, that's not, everything you have is a plant defense. You'll also see evidence of organisms trying to figure their way around it. So we mentioned nematodes. Another defense that's necessary in the border environment is against bacteria. And this is just showing that there are bacteria that have figured out how to be a little more effective against that border cell environment. And what they found is the Bacteria are a little more effective here at being able to basically attack the plants and disable their growth. So without bacteria, the roots grow better. With bacteria, the roots are not growing as well. And then by disabling these nuclease enzymes, so bacteria's enzymes that can basically digest that DNA in the environment, that's their strategy for growing in closer to the roots, is actually digest away the protective environment there. And so these two in particular, the delta, the deletion of the nuc B gene and deletion of nuc A and B allow the sort of prevents the bacteria from getting closer to the roots on this. So nematodes, bacteria, fungus, all these things are also hazards of the soil environment. So if we neglect the soil environment and the roots of the plants, we also might be neglecting some of the things that they're suffering from. So I mentioned the root hairs. These are produced pretty close to the growing tip of the plant. And we saw hairs as part of our coverage of the epidermal system, the dermal system. And we kind of considered the coverage of the above ground surface with hairs. So you sometimes see hairy leaves or hairy stems on plants. And hairs are indispensable when it comes to making the roots. And just like we saw in the shoot epidermis, the hairs on the root are also produced as outgrowths of epidermal cells. So it's a little bit hard to see exactly where some of these are coming from. This one in the background, you can kind of see where the epidermal cell is raised up and then maybe grows out into this hair. Other ones of these, they're just outgrowths of particular hairs. And in this image, this one here kind of shows you this cell is part of the epidermis, but it extends out and becomes that root hair. This one, I don't know if that's the same cell or one behind it, but it's growing out. So important origin for the root hairs, they're just extensions of existing epidermal cells. And like I said before, they don't last very long. As we'll see, the available epidermis, the epidermis that is like open to the environment, that only happens just after that bit of root has been made. Things get different as they grow. All right, so let's get into the function a little bit of these different parts of the root.